Welcome back, America. I'm Hugh Hewitt. Happy New Year to you. Jim Talent is my guest. Good morning, Senator. Happy New Year. I want you to tee up on your thoughts when you saw Joe Biden sort of address the nation yesterday and then shuffle off.
Well, we've been watching it you for so long that, of course, it was not a surprise, and I can never understand how people who've been around Washington and have seen him, I mean, for the last 50 years, could possibly have believed he was not impaired. And this is not a political statement, I served with him. I believe I presided over the Senate once when he was speaking. Anybody who knew Joe Biden or had watched Joe Biden, I was there for the 2012 vice presidential debate with Paul Ryan, where Biden was sharp as a tack. How anybody could have watched that over the years and actually believed, and I think some members of the press convinced themselves that he was not impaired. It's simply beyond me. It's
it's scandalous. I don't think they persuaded themselves, Jim. I think they knew, and they decided it was better for the country to have an impaired president than Donald Trump, and they didn't believe that Kamala Harris could do the job. So the consequences of a political error in 2020 manifested itself in the largest media scandal ever. What do you make of my assessment?
Yeah, well, you're right, although what I will say is when you devalue truth consistently and uniformly, I think there comes a time when you are yourself unable to know what is true and what isn't. I mean, there's a lot written about this. It's part moral, it's part psychological, but for whatever reason, it's an absolute abdication. How the press, which is supposed to tell the people what is going on, could possibly have ignored this month after month after month.
Yeah, Jim, there was a moment on New Year's Eve before the tragedy struck in New Orleans when a stand-up comic was roasting CNN on CNN's show. I've only seen the clip. I don't watch television on New Year's Eve. And the comic said, I've been playing smaller venues, small clubs, but bigger audiences than CNN. And they said, ouch, and it was funny because CNN's audience is so low. But I do think we are in the middle of a collapse of legacy media. And by collapse, I mean just a complete loss of audience because they will not recognize what Dwayne and I were talking about on Friday or on Wednesday. The first step in any 12-step program is you have a problem. They don't realize they've been hiring on other than talent for 30 years, and their problem is it's a terrible product, and they don't ask the right questions. Can it be saved or fixed?
Well, yes. The first thing you do is you acknowledge and you accept responsibility, and everybody do that personally. And then you commit yourself to the twin goals of truth and transparency. And this relates to what you've been talking about regarding what Kash Patel's got to do with the Bureau. The first thing is to commit themselves to truth and transparency. You're not going to say anything that isn't true, and you're going to err on the side of transparency unless it's absolutely impossible. You and Noah were talking about, this is a hard question. Do we be transparent with, but for now we are erring on the side of transparency. You use language that describes material reality. It is radical Islamic terrorism. It is not radical extremism. You use language that is meaningful to people, and you regain trust gradually over time. It takes a long time to build up trust, but you can lose it very quickly. So
it's gained in ounces and lost in pounds. That's what people always say. Trust is gained in ounces and lost in pounds. Let me play for you the first reaction of the FBI, the Assistant Special Agent in charge, Althea Duncan. I do not blame her. She's young. But cut number 6.
Kirkpatrick said we'll be taking over the investigative lead for this event. This is not a terrorist event. What it is right now is their improvised explosive devices.
All right, Senator, I'm not going to. She changed her tone in about 3 hours. She was as nervous as could be. She's in over her head. But she has been trained to say it's not a terrorist event. That's my only. They're all trained that way.
That's the point. That's the point. That was programmatic. I mean, that's policy in the Bureau. You say this is not a terrorist event. When what the least she should have done, I think, under the circumstances, was say, we don't know at this stage what the motive, and then she could have discussed the signs. He was sporting a flag, an ISIS flag, so there are indications, but we don't know. In other words, truth and transparency to people. But the Bureau has been programmed in many contexts not to do that. I'm like you. I mean, I started my political career, my career in Washington, with great respect for the Bureau. I don't have it anymore. And Kash Patel has got to establish priorities. He's got to quickly identify and get rid of the people who are going to fight him. And he's got to bring in people who are committed to his priorities. And he needs to do that, and I'm sure he will, in a way that is not partisan or political in his respect. So, and there's no area where that's more important than fighting domestic terrorism. I mean, you have
Jim
to
Talent,
have
if you'll stand by, I'm going to abuse your time this morning because I want to talk to you about how does one change an organization. Very few people have the ability and the training that Jim Talent does. Former senator from Missouri, head of national security studies at the Reagan Institute. I got to talk to him about the Navy, and I got to talk to him about the new government, and I just got to abuse his time. Welcome back, America. I'm talking with former Senator Jim Talent, and I asked him to stick around because I want to pose a big question to him. Long ago and far away, Senator, President Reagan nominated me to the deputy director of OPM, and I was confirmed, and I became the deputy director after being the general counsel for a long time, and I stayed to be the acting director after Connie Horner left. So I know OPM. I also know OPM has got maybe a half dozen political appointees. They've got some senior executive service people. They were quite good in my day, which is a long time ago. But you can't fire them. I want people to understand, Kash Patel can't come in and fire SES people. He can move them. He can reassign them. But it takes a while to figure out who your friends are. Do you think the conservative movement, MAGA or GOPE, then that's the two ends of it. Do they have any idea how hard this is to turn a federal government around?
Oh, yeah. In part because, and here we have an advantage, the president's been there. I mean, he did this the first time. He knows the difficulty. People like Susie Wiles know the difficulty. I studied this in the context of the Department of Defense, which is different because you do have more direct authority over a larger number of people in the department, but basically you need to make your priorities clear, including to all the career people, and you need to really think through those. What are my priorities going to be? What is it I want us to do? What is it I don't want us to do? Then you canvass your authorities that you have over people. It was always my belief, Hugh, that you make the priorities clear and then take a little time to see who is honestly trying to go along, even if they don't agree with you politically. And then you isolate the people who are really going to be the resistance and the troublemakers. And you deal with them using the authorities that you have, which could include, as you say, transferring. I think they need some innovative ideas. Like, for example, if some regional head of the Bureau issues some memo that we should start spying on Catholic congregations, and you remember that happened in Richmond. I think I might do something. Yeah, if I was Patel, I might say to them, you know what I want you to do? I want you to go down to the diocese. I want you to make an appointment with the bishop, ask him if he'll participate in this. Call the press, and you publicly apologize. In other words,
I like that idea. I like that idea.
Yeah,
I think that
you do it.
Kash Patel, if he sits down and spends an hour in conversation with every senior executive at the FBI, and the SES is an unusual organization. It's part of the 1978 Personnel Reform Act that Jimmy Carter oversaw. But you can move people, but you do need some career people. It's very difficult. Now, what I wanted to ask you about, Jim Talent, is we have three big thinkers coming into the second Trump administration on national security. Over at the Defense Department, Bridge Colby is going to be the Undersecretary of Policy. I assume Pete Hegseth is going to be confirmed. The deputy is going to be confirmed. But the big think job is the Undersecretary, and that's Bridge Colby. Michael Waltz is going to become the National Security Council, and there's a lot of operational stuff there, but it's also the big thinker. And then Michael Anton is heading over to PPO under Michael Rubio, and a policy planning office is usually the big think plank. What do you think comes out of these three people's big think orientation at the beginning of Trump 2.0?
Well, that's a good question. There's no question that that they are going to emphasize that China is the pacing threat, and the reason is our margin of error in dealing with China, because they are so powerful, because they have gone so far down the road of perfecting conflict in so many different domains. We have to understand they don't think of conflict just in the kinetic domain. They also understand it in the narrative domain, in the economic domain, in the domains of sharp power, et cetera. So I think the three of them are going to work together very well to develop a plan for how we, first of all, strengthen short-term deterrence in Indo-PACOM so as to prevent this breaking out into actual, kinetic warfare with the United States. And then second, working with organizations like Commerce and the Trade Representative, how we organize the tools of power so as to contain, and I don't know whether they'll use that word, but to contain China and then win this conflict with China, which is likely to go on for many, many years. I think that will include defining what victory is, and I think it will include how we have to change the architecture of national security. How do we have to update the Cold War architecture? And you're right, these are very, very strong thinkers as well as effective and decisive people. So one key to this, and this, if you're the president, I would imagine he's on this, and Susie Wiles, they have to play well together. You know the old thing about, did you get good grades in kindergarten for playing well in the sandbox together? It's important that these key players have good personal relationships. And I know they know each other. I think they go in with those relationships, and I think they'll continue them.
So, Senator, what is realistic for people to expect about, for example, the allocation of the Department of Defense budget? It seems to me it's clear that we've got to break the 1/3, 1/3, 1/3, or maybe it's 31%, 31%, 31%, what's left over for Space Force. Do we have the people in place to take the deep breath and say, all right, the Navy is where our chips are going for the next 4 years, and we're going to invest at every level in the Navy's modernization and its capacity? Do you think they have that ability to do?
Well, first they have to make that decision. I think the decision is going to occur almost by default. It would be better if it was more purposeful because, again, China's the pacing threat, and Indo-PACOM is a maritime and an air domain. Now, part of the problem here, as you know, is we are making up for what is literally decades of underfunding and underperformance in recapitalizing the Department of Defense. The Navy, of course, is an example of that, but the other services are the same. So there's not enough money to go around, and we don't have the industrial base in order to spend all the money we ought to be spending, assuming we could appropriate it. So they're going to have to do things. They're going to have to do what they can do, not raise expectations too high, and aim at rebuilding the defense industrial base, strengthening short-term deterrence, and that is going to include, I think, beyond question, more money for the Navy, even if some of the other services suffer.
And when we say more money for the Navy, though, and by the way, are you pressed for time, Senator? Because if not, I'll keep you for one more second as we talk about this. Have I got time with you?
No, that's fine.
You are fine, good.
I just glanced down the clock. I'm okay.
Okay, well, then we'll come back in a minute and we'll talk about how one redirects the resources. Stand by, America. I'm Hugh Hewitt. Jim Talent has agreed to stay with me because I want to talk a little bit about how one would set up a strategic approach to the necessary reform at the Pentagon budget. Senator, the Undersecretary of Policy, Bridge Colby, he's designated, he'll get confirmed. What's his job? What do you understand the Undersecretary of Policy to do?
Well, statutorily, it's to represent the equities of the Department of Defense in foreign policy decisions and supervise a collection of intelligence to that end, et cetera. So if there is a crisis in the Middle East and there's a discussion about whether we need an aircraft carrier task force in the Eastern Med, if the secretary, doesn't represent the department, then the under will do that. As a practical matter, he participates in foreign policy decisions of the administration on behalf of the Department of Defense and maintains a staff that enables him to do it. That's one of the reasons it's really important that he works well with the Department of State because you don't want a turf battle developing. But with somebody like Bridge,
go ahead. You were going to say something about Bridge Colby.
Somebody like Bridge Colby, who is well known and respected, and also known throughout the administration, then he may exercise a more outsized role. I mean, again, he has to work carefully with the secretary and the DepSec, to that end. Again, what we hope is that, and I believe this will happen, and I think Hegseth is very oriented in this direction anyway, is that they view themselves as a team, and they don't have to silo everything out according to strict, statutory designations.
But if I'm just talking in generalities for the benefit of our audience, the SecDef is operational. He's chain of command. Secretary Hegseth takes orders from the president and transmits them to the combatant commanders and has big picture discussions with the Joint Chiefs about what to do. The DepSec runs the building, runs contracting, and they got a really smart guy coming in to do that, Feinberg. And then the Undersec for policy is supposed to be the big thinker. Over at State, Marco Rubio runs day to day. He's constantly on the road doing diplomacy. The DepSec of State runs Secretary of State, and then the head of PPO is supposed to be the big thinker. And then Mike Waltz is supposed to be both operational and big thinker. To your knowledge, do they ever just sit down and agree, we are going to do this about that for 4 years? We're committing to shipbuilding, we're committing to the Navy. Do they ever do that sort of exercise?
Oh, sure. The first thing they'll do is a national security strategy. And they'll all work together on that. And then there'll be, the president obviously has the final decision in all of this. And we have a very active president in terms of, across the board, but especially in terms of foreign policy. So Donald Trump's going to be making these decisions, but you got a national security strategy. From that, you write a national defense strategy that incorporates your priorities. And that's where you'll see the priorities for all of the services, and in particular for the Navy. Now, the Secretary of Defense is the head both of the operational part of the Department of Defense and the build and sustain mission, which in my opinion is more crucial now. And in other words, building up the force, sustaining it over time, we need to build up the tools of power. Policy is important. Operations are obviously important. But if we don't have ships, we don't have any judgment to make about where we're going to send them. And I think that's where Hegseth and the DepSec are going to be spending a lot of their time personally. And I hope they do. We need a Secretary of Defense who says, my job is to do what Cap Weinberger did. I'm going to rebuild the force.
And that, boy, would that be welcome. But it would require a cross-departmental commitment, and you'd have to have Russ Vought, who is going to be the OMB director again, in, right? I'm backing into the point that OMB ought not to drive policy. OMB ought to execute the decisions of the president and the national security team. Agree or disagree?
I agree, and I'll say two things. In the first place, that's where the Office of Secretary of Defense, and in particular the Secretary himself, needs to have a strong relationship with the president, so that the president makes clear to OMB, look, needs are driving the budget. The budget is not driving how we define need. That's number one. And number two, the people you have not mentioned so far that are absolutely crucial to this effort are the service secretaries and the chiefs. 3/4 of the money the department spends is spent through the services, and the service secretaries and chiefs have the statutory authority in terms of how they're going to spend the money. So whether we are able to rebuild the Navy, whether we're able to recapitalize the aircraft in the Air Force, including unmanned, whether we're able to get the Space Force off the ground and harden and diversify and disperse the architecture, that's going to depend a whole lot on the service secretaries and the chiefs. So they need to be empowered, they need to make decisions, and they need to be held accountable by the Secretary of Defense. And
so Jim Talent, I'm going to upset every single listener who's a member of the Army right now, and maybe some Air Force people. Would you welcome Donald Trump directing everyone on day one? We are breaking the 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 model. We are going to a 40% Navy, 30% Army, 30% Air Force. Just do it. And do not bring me a budget that does anything other than that. Just do it. Would you welcome that direction?
I would certainly welcome the president saying, or the secretary saying, once he's confirmed, we're not going to have some arbitrary formula for dispersing money. This is not a question of turf battles within the department. This is a question of what are the primary threats to the United States? What is the role of the Department of Defense in combating those threats? And what are the priorities that we need to fund? Now, I think that will result in greater money for the forces that are primarily responsible for Indo-PACOM, which is the Navy, number one, Air Force, and then, of course, we have to continue building up and protecting the space architecture because everything depends on our ability to communicate. Now, I don't
space
know
and
that,
cyber.
and I certainly, yeah, space and cyber. Now, if I was a SecDef, I would probably say to the president, I'll need your support on this, but I'm the one who ought to be directing this. And I think Donald Trump would agree with that. I don't think Trump wants to get into percentages for this or that or the other thing. I think he wants his Secretary of Defense to run the department, to prioritize what he's doing, and to hold, again, the service secretaries accountable for accomplishing their priorities. If you get John Lehman on the program and ask him how he rebuilt the Navy, he'll tell you he established a tight chain of command within the Navy, and he held everybody accountable. I mean, that's
well, the
what
new
it comes down
Secretary
to.
of the
That's
Navy,
more important.
the new SecNav is a guy named John Phelan. I don't know him, very, very successful businessman and investor. I'm hoping he brings those business chops to this. But I do think they need a declaration at some point that it's the Navy. We are a naval power. We've got to go back to the fact that we are a naval power, and we have to go TR or FDR or Ronald Reagan. And I wrote about this last week. It's the legacy that Donald Trump should reach for. He's got judges. He'll have another Trump economic boom. But rebuilding the Navy, he said he was going to do it in the first term, and it didn't happen. Do you think if he starts on day one, that we would notice it by the end of term two?
Yeah. In fairness to the Trump administration, they didn't have the industrial base. I've said on the program here in so many different forums, power is the result of intention and capability. Intention can change quickly. Intention has changed, and it's going to change more. Capability can't. I can't flip a switch and produce a submarine. So they've wanted 2 submarines a year, attack submarines a year. I think for close to 10 years, Congress has been funding it, and they're getting 1.3 because they don't have the shipyard capabilities. So we have to rebuild the defense industrial base. It's not going to happen overnight. I don't think we should raise expectations of a 400-ship Navy at the end of this time. Now, there are things you can do quickly. Don't retire ships. See what ships you've got in mothballs. Establish a low-end line of ships. Our friend Jerry Hendricks is very big on this, something where you can produce a lot of ships quickly. So you can use the smaller yards that right now we're not using. So there's a lot of things that you can do, and I'm convinced they're going to look at it. I'm excited by what's going to happen. What scares me, is how much time we have. Because the Davidson window is upon us, basically. And so I think short-term deterrence, things like Mike Gallagher's talked about, the anti-Navy, asymmetric things we can do to send the right message to China that, look, don't try anything with Hong Kong because not only do we have the will, with Taiwan, not only do we have the will, but we have the capability to oppose you. And I'm sure, watch the national defense. You watch the national defense strategy. The things you're looking for, you're going to see if they're going to be there in the national defense strategy.
Well, then they ought to do it within 2 months. I mean, we really don't have a lot of time here. Senator Jim Talent, thank you for the extra amount of dollop of time today. I appreciate it to start the new year off.